Mariane Pearl steadied herself on the edge of the bed in the small Karachi guest house, one hand resting over her pregnant belly as she tried to quiet the unease that had been growing for days. Her husband, journalist Daniel Pearl, had left for an interview that morning with sources he believed could help him trace the link between Richard Reed and militant networks in Pakistan. The plan was routine for a reporter who had covered conflict zones for years. But Mariane had watched him leave with a heaviness she couldn't explain. The streets outside were louder than usual, the traffic more erratic, and the military presence in the city felt sharper, as if the tension beneath it had suddenly risen to the surface. Hours passed without word from Daniel. Calls went unanswered. His driver reported he had never returned to the hotel. By late afternoon, dread pressed hard enough that Mariane contacted colleagues, embassy staff, and local authorities. Even then, the information that trickled in came slow and uncertain. People who had arranged the interview were unreachable. Addresses didn't match. Phone numbers led nowhere. As daylight faded from the windows, Mariane realized that the silence itself was a message. Something had gone wrong, and she was alone in a foreign city, trying to understand where her husband had vanished. The next morning, Pakistani investigators confirmed what she feared. Daniel had been abducted by a militant group that claimed he was a spy. The kidnappers released emails showing him bound, holding a newspaper as proof of life. The demands were vague and shifting, mixing political grievances with impossible conditions. Mariane read every line with a rising sense of disbelief that hardened into determination. She refused to break down. She asked questions, pressed officials, and insisted that every lead be followed. She moved through the guest house with deliberate focus, steadying herself with the knowledge that stress could harm her unborn child. Outside the investigation rooms, reporters gathered daily. Some recognized her as a journalist in her own right. Others watched her as if she were part of the story they were covering. But Mariane pushed past the attention and directed her energy toward the task of finding Daniel. She cataloged every detail investigators shared, cross-checked timelines, and revisited the names of people he had met during his reporting. Colleagues from the Wall Street Journal flew in to support her, filling the guest house with phones, maps, and lists. The room became a command center, and Mariane became the anchor of it. Inside the city, authorities combed neighborhoods where militant groups had influence. They followed tips, infiltrated safe houses, and interrogated suspects who could barely agree on the most basic facts. The case became a collision of overlapping networks, criminal, ideological, and opportunistic. Mariane watched the investigation advance and stall again. Each new raid or lead brought a jolt of hope, followed by long stretches of waiting that pressed against her composure. She slept in brief intervals, waking with her hand on her abdomen, reminding herself that her child needed calm even when she had none left to give. Messages from the kidnappers grew more pointed. They accused Daniel of espionage and issued threats tied to foreign policy demands beyond Mariane's reach. Authorities struggled to locate the group, and their updates seemed to shift daily. Still, Mariane insisted on being present for every briefing. She listened to the coded language investigators used to mask uncertainty and learned to read the tension behind their expressions. She confronted officials when decisions felt slow or careless, pushing them to stay focused on Daniel rather than the politics surrounding the case. On February 1st, investigators found evidence that deepened the urgency. A computer seized in a raid contained photographs of Daniel in captivity. The images, though limited, indicated he had been held in harsh conditions. The room around him appeared small and makeshift, suggesting the kidnappers were moving frequently. Mariane absorbed the news with a composed stillness that stunned those around her. She asked direct questions about the images, the location, and the timeline. She did not allow herself the release of fear because she believed that any sign of collapse could shift the investigation off course. Behind closed doors, however, she grappled with moments of crushing uncertainty. She spoke aloud to her unborn child, telling the baby about Daniel, their life together, and the hope that he would return. She repeated the words as a rhythm she could hold when everything else felt unstable. Her friends watched her closely, ready to shield her from the news they feared was coming, but not willing to let her face the burden of waiting alone. On February 21st, 2002, confirmation arrived that no one wanted to deliver. Authorities had obtained a video recorded by the kidnappers. It showed Daniel Pearl's murder. For investigators, it was evidence. For the world, it would become a symbol of the brutality rising throughout the region. For Mariane, it was a moment that split her life into a before and after she could never bridge. She did not collapse when she heard the news. Instead, she stood still, breathing slowly, holding the weight of the grief, while bracing herself for the child who would soon enter the world without his father. In the days that followed, the investigation shifted toward capturing those responsible. Pakistani authorities arrested members of the militant group, including Ahmed Omar Saeed Sheikh, a British-born extremist who had orchestrated the kidnapping. He confessed publicly and later recanted, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Additional suspects were arrested for their roles in luring Daniel to the interview, transporting him between locations, and carrying out the killing. Mariane cooperated with investigators, providing details about Daniel's movements and the early hours of the disappearance. Despite the arrests, Mariane had to navigate the new reality of raising a child alone while carrying trauma few could understand. She gave birth to her son, Adam, in May 2002. The hospital room was quiet, filled with friends and colleagues who stepped in where Daniel could not. Holding her child, Mariane felt both the depth of her loss and the start of something that would keep her moving forward. Her resolve became clearer in the months that followed. She wrote about her experience in a memoir that documented not only Daniel's captivity, but also the endurance required to survive it while pregnant. She kept advocating for justice and transparency, determined that her husband's story would not be reduced to a single act of violence. She worked to expose the networks that had facilitated the crime and supported efforts to protect journalists working in dangerous regions. Years later, Mariane continued speaking publicly about resilience, motherhood, and the responsibility to confront extremism. Her survival was not the kind marked by physical escape from captivity, but by the ability to remain steady in the face of devastation, to bring a child into the world while surrounded by fear, and to rebuild a life defined not by violence, but by strength. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.